Um, I want to welcome everybody who have signed in on time, and I don't want to hold off any time because I think the content of this workshop is really very timely in today's environment. So my name is Scott Winter. I'm with the Collaborative Commons. The Collaborative Commons, for those of you who don't know, is really a slowly growing community, or maybe it's a quickly growing. We had about 10 signups last week. Of individuals who really want to come together to learn different models, methods, learn tools, resources, and really create some relationships about coming together to solve today's wicked challenges. And today's topic is really one that I've been a real fan of for the last, I don't know, probably about 15 or so years. And it's really about the idea of future scouting. And today's guest is Jim Schreier. Is I get that right, Schreier?
Schreier.
Oh, Schreier, thank you. Jim Schreier,
okay.
who's been a mentor of mine. I've reached out to him on several occasions, who does a lot of this work with Joel Barker and his work around the strategic exploration tools that he's created over the years. And for those of you who don't know Joel Barker, Joel is really, I mean, he's popular, but back in the 90s, he had quite a movement. He had a whole video series called The Paradigm, the Business of Paradigms. And so if you're not familiar with that, highly recommend you kind of take a look at it because it's as timely today as it was when he first kind of put it out there. But Jim, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome.
Again, people in the top, if you do have a question and you want to speak to Jim directly, just raise your hand and I'll allow you to speak. If you have other questions in the chat, feel free to ask them and I'll make sure to capture them as we go. But Jim, could you give us a little bit of background of who you are and how you came into this work?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I am a former university professor who decided to leave that profession about almost 20 years ago now because of the amount of consulting that I was doing. So I became a consultant. Obviously in the 90s, well, actually going back a little bit before that, started what all my friends and colleagues referred to as my guru search. I started deciding that I wanted to work with some of the expert, knowledgeable people in various fields that I was consulting in, and wanted to get to know them, wanted to work with them, and if possible, get certified to work with them. And as you mentioned, Scott, in the 90s, one of the gurus of the world at the time was futurist Joel Barker. So I reached out to Joel, having seen his videos, particularly on paradigms and vision, and reached out and started asking, are you certifying people in anything? And it turns out that I very fortunately caught the very first certification for the implications wheel. And now some 21 years later, began working much more closely with Joel, helping him develop some tools or variations on some of the tools that he has created, and began working very closely with him as his director of training. So he's not the only guru that I've worked with over the years, but he's certainly been the one I've spent most of my time with recently. So.
Wow. Well, thank you. And so what were you a professor of?
Business administration, taught organizational management, human resources primarily. Other than that, at some point along the line, I taught everything except economics and accounting. So taught production and marketing and retailing and all kinds of stuff, but mainly management and human resources.
What about Joel's work did you find attractive that really kind of sucked you in? Because again, from my view, I just saw it because my mind works, I think, very similar to how the tool works, which isn't always comfortable because my head explodes into possibilities very quickly. But what really excited you about his work, and how have you seen it, really be of service to you and your clients over the last 21 years?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think I'd have to really start thinking about which one I saw first, whether it was the power of vision or paradigms. But both of those hit me as unbelievable. The power of vision because of its strength, and what I already saw as something that was helping organizations, and what I saw happening in the 90s with the consulting work that I was doing, which basically was with bankers around the world, was that banks had this interesting problem that a lot of organizations have. They know what their mission is, but they don't know what their vision is. So they struggled with that dynamic, and I've wrestled with that with organizations of all kinds of different sizes and types ever since. So that one really struck. And then I saw paradigms, and that really started or hit with a whole serious connection to this whole idea of thinking and thinking about the future. So that's what kind of connected to it. And then along came the implications wheel, which we'll be talking about, and helping organizations think about the future. And that became a key focus of what I love doing.
So part of the reason why I wanted to invite you into this is, and I think the title of really how do we, scout the future in kind of chaotic times. And I think I shared with you a number of people that I've been speaking with. I do a lot of retreats. I do a lot of strategic planning group meetings and stuff. And, a lot of plans were created at the end of the year, at the beginning of this year. And now that the coronavirus has really kind of wiped out any sort of plan, what do you see unfolded? Maybe you can just jump into your presentation, but you would talk a little bit about, how the paradigm has really just blown up. So maybe we can start there.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna start with a little bit of an introduction, but then I'm going to immediately talk about the paradigm piece before I even talk about some of the tools. So
super. Well, jump right in then, brother.
Yeah, be happy to get started with it. So Joel Barker he talks about it as even in the 80s when he got started. Joel Barker talked about the fact that when he decided to get into the business of consulting, because he was a teacher before that, he took a look at it, and as probably most people on this webinar know or are familiar with, that was the era of strategic planning exploding. And Joel decided that he didn't want to get into the strategic planning field because that's where everybody else was. So he took a look at it and said, you know what, I'm going to do something different. I'm trained as a futurist. I'm educated as a futurist. I'm going to do strategic exploration instead of strategic planning. And he defined that very clearly. He said strategic exploration is what you do before you plan. It is qualitative, not quantitative. So it doesn't yield specific results that say we're going to increase our budget by X $1 million for next year and do this, 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 and this. It looks at qualitative information, and the implications wheel frames that best by talking about what's possible. Based on what he developed in terms of the different tools he developed over the years, what he likes to talk about is simple processes that can be easily learned. And one of the other very interesting characteristics of everything that Joel does is his processes are all very inclusive. They are all based on what we later learned more formally, and we now refer to frequently as diversity of the group, wisdom of crowds, being very important dynamics of everything that we do and every tool that we have. Joel talked about 3 different ways of looking at it very quickly. He talked about the fact that we need to monitor what's going on in the world right now. And in everything that's happening with the coronavirus, this is fascinating, and I'll tell you, it is tough to keep up with. One of the things I spotted today, because I've got some things that help me monitor a lot of different stuff about this, thinking about the future and the strategic exploration that we do, is the explosion. And anybody that's listening on this or watching this can get in on this. The explosion of articles talking about the unintended consequences of the coronavirus that are popping up. Now, I want to clarify something right there, in that we don't believe that very many of those are unintended consequences. They're unanticipated consequences. Most of them, the coronavirus was a pretty big surprise, but most of these things that are happening, if you take a look and say, if this happens, could we have easily predicted that this other thing was going to happen? It's not some law that makes these things happen that we have no control over. I just spotted 3 that I noted in a posting that I did, but right before this started, I looked and I saw 3 or 4 more articles. They are talking about the unintended consequences of cyberbullying increasing.
Mm,
because everybody's at home on their computers.
right.
They're talking about the shortage of drugs causing an increase in addiction, people going to rehab. My son is actually an addiction counselor and supervisor. They're already facing that. They're getting flooded with new clients saying, I can't get drugs, I got to get into treatment.
Wow.
Pretty predictable that
Right, right, right.
this quarantine and the inability to ship things and get things moving is going to cause, it's shutting down the drug supplies.
Wow.
Um,
As you're talking, Jim, I think that's the other reason why I wanted to reach out to you, because I was listening to an interview last week with a gentleman who was pretty connected globally around just pandemics and just dealing with public health in general. And he said, one of the problems I think we face as humans is we think really well linearly. And so, but to your point, there's just so many byproducts of this episode that we're going through that the mind just can't really get its head around it. And that's why I love this concept that we share within the implications tool and the strategic exploration tools. It forces your brain to get out of that linear mindset. And I think that typical way that we're thinking about today's challenge, we're not going to be able to solve it if we're not really willing to open up and get this diverse thinking around the table to say, okay, knowing that there is a reduction in access to drugs, mental health drugs, for example, what are the implications of those? Keep blowing it out there so that we really can be prepared in our organizations and in our communities for what's about to unfold. And we can't be thinking, gosh, we didn't think about that. So we've got to be really proactive, I think, in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And another good one that I spotted yesterday was they're talking about another quote. Again, I don't like the term unintended consequence. They're talking about the fact that there's been all this hoarding of things. They're talking about there's going to be a tremendous increase in food waste.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because people are buying stuff that they're going to end up not using, or it's going to go bad because they bought 6 weeks worth of lettuce or something like that and didn't take care of it.
Right.
So it's very interesting. So there's a lot of things right now that have to be monitored, and that's tough to do when you're also trying to keep things going, particularly in an organization, and you're unfortunately fighting a lot of fires. So it's a really important dynamic, and we speak to the importance of that.
So let me ask you on that monitoring piece, for those
sure.
who are listening who might be in a particular industry. Do you suggest that they kind of just monitor within their bubble, or what? How far out would you go in terms of their monitoring? Let's say I'm in finance, or let's say I'm in healthcare. What do I need to be paying attention to? The entire picture, or just certain components of it?
No, you need to pay attention. You can certainly pay attention to those things within your world, but you also need to pay attention to things in other worlds, particularly in worlds where maybe you might not normally look, but where there's lots happening right now.
Yeah.
And for example, you just mentioned one, healthcare.
Right.
I don't care what industry you're in. Everybody should kind of be watching what's happening in healthcare right now, because what's happening in healthcare is affecting so many other things in terms of supply chains issue, in terms of staffing issues, in terms of physical resources. Right now you can look at almost any locale, I suspect, particularly in major cities, and see what people are saying in terms of needing increase hospital space.
Right.
I just saw an article for everyone around the world. I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I just saw an article this afternoon that they are surveying our state fairgrounds to see what can be used there to take care of patients. It's like, what? So watching what's happening in healthcare. The other one, and this one's kind of funny to me, because for the last year or so, I've been telling people in every seminar, when I talk about watching for trends, I say, watch the food service industry, particularly fast foods, apps, and delivery, because they are adapting so fast to changes.
Right.
Somebody does something every week and ups the ante on their app or delivery in food service. I was saying that a year ago. Now what's happening?
Right. Well, it's a force. I mean, those dark kitchens that have been popping up
Yeah,
everywhere. Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's what people don't understand is just how there was a great book that I shared. I don't know if you've read it, Jim, called The Future is Faster Than You Think. And it really is talking about how converging technologies are really, really speeding up everything. And I think even that is what are the implications of the convergence of technologies in terms of what that's going to do to transportation or what that's going to
Yep,
do to, so there are a lot of these questions that are out there. So let's continue
absolutely.
on. So you have so in terms of monitoring, just make sure that if you are leading, just be sure that your head's outside of the bubble. And I think, again, it's one of the things from a brain-based perspective, it's really hard if we're trying to stay focused. If I'm leading an organization, asking myself what I need to pay attention to is sometimes hard to do when the most important thing, especially now in a crisis, is taking care of those that are closest to me or closest to the business.
Yep.
But if I also have to plan for the future and hoping that I'm going to stay relevant, I'd really encouraging anyone out there listening to this to say, okay, let's maybe broaden your scope a little bit more on this one. So,
Yep, and it's tough to do for exactly the reasons you just mentioned. But again, one of the things I'm watching it is, am I seeing some examples of organizations that are, yes, dealing with today, but also dealing with the future? I got an email, I'll give you two quick examples. I got an email last week from a theater in Illinois, so nearby to me in Wisconsin. And it was the typical email that you're getting from every organization right now. We're shut down, we're taking care of our people. But the second paragraph of the message said, but we want you to let you know we're thinking about our future. And then they went on to describe that. There's an article in Inc. magazine today online that talks about some of the things that McDonald's is doing right now to prepare for the future of what's going to happen next. And whether it's accurate or not, I'm not sure, but it's a very interesting article of the changes they're making now. And the interpretation is they're adjusting for the changes that are going to be ongoing even a year from now.
Well, again, on that point, there's caution to be put out there because, again, maybe they're making an adjustment today based on some assumptions, but they might roll it out and think, gosh, why were we thinking? Because they didn't anticipate well enough. So I'm always cautious when people to me, I can only imagine that the next thing after people are saying in that email, hey, we're looking about our future. And then what they're then saying is, holy shit, because it's so big.
Well, and Scott, that's where your point is correct, because if they're thinking about their future in a linear fashion, that's gonna potentially mislead them, because right now with kind of the chaos, the odds that linear future is the one that's going to come true is probably unlikely. So that leads us to the implications wheel, which we'll be talking about in a couple of minutes. And there is a third element that we probably won't get into in great detail today, but it does represent one of our other tools, and that is what Joel talks about as convergent thinking, which is what are all these trends and innovations and issues that are happening? What are they doing internally to our organization? How are they affecting our strategic objectives? And that's maybe we'll have time to at least mention that, and then people can look at that our website for additional information on some of these things that we don't talk about.
A question that I sometimes ask on that convergent question around trends is I kind of frame trends in two different frameworks. One is the assisting trends, the ones that we can kind of link onto that can pull us, and then the resisting trends that we have to kind of, really hunker down and think strategically around how do we break through them. So a lot of times when we think about trends, oftentimes they're viewed as, one or the other, but you got to be looking at both and how you leverage both in the way you solve a problem kind of thing. And sometimes even using an assisting trend to get past a resisting trend. So
yeah, absolutely. Because our trends can either help us achieve our strategic objectives, or they can make it harder for us to achieve them. So absolutely, that's absolutely correct in terms of what we're talking about and thinking about the future a little bit. Interestingly, and it's part of Joel's work from a foundational standpoint, for anybody that's familiar with his unbelievably successful video, The New Business Paradigms. Very interesting how this has exploded back on the scene. It's exploded in just the last couple of weeks, but it's it's seen a resurgence over the last year or so with Joel's work. He had more requests a couple of years ago for speeches on paradigms than he had in the years prior to that, because people were basically calling him and saying, you know, that was really popular back in the 80s and 90s, and everybody still uses the term now, but they really don't understand it. Right. So we need to relook at this. And I've just done 2 major presentations this year, one in January and one just 3 weeks ago, on paradigms. And now over the weekend, got an email from a college president saying, okay, I just reread the book, because one of the basic principles of Joel's paradigm principles is when a new paradigm comes into play, everybody goes back to zero. Right. And doesn't that describe exactly what's happening to us? And it's not really a new paradigm, and I'll explain that in a minute, but it definitely busted the curve and put everybody back to zero. So one of the things that's important in a very brief commentary on paradigm principles for change is, what are those principles? What about this thing called the paradigm curve? And then something that we talk about in terms of interrogating paradigms. What we talk about is, if you don't understand the subtleties of paradigm shifts, you can't explore the future, because paradigms, easy description, and I could give you 20 different synonyms for the word paradigms, methods, mindsets, all kinds of things. But basically, the way we look at it is that paradigms are problem-solving mechanisms. And what happens is, something that's called, to understand this and use a simple little tool that we call the paradigm curve, is to understand what triggers a paradigm shift. And understanding how important that is in the level of maturity of your organization's paradigms on the curve. And it's really simple to understand, because this is what the paradigm curve looks like. When a new paradigm comes around, it's solving very few problems because very few people are aware of the solution. The first people that bought a digital music player, even before the iPod, it was a very small number of people. It's those early adopters of an innovation that get in on something. It's solving a problem, but a lot of people don't even know about that yet. Somewhere along the line, most of these paradigms, if they become successful, they literally explode. There's a rapid increase in the implementation of that paradigm, because it's solving a lot of problems and everybody's aware of it. So you could talk about the iPod, you could talk about food delivery, not the fact that pizza places in the United States delivered pizza decades ago, but delivery from the delivery services that we have now with Grubhub and DoorDash and Uber Eats and everything else that's out there around the world. Mm-hmm. It's exploding because more people became aware of, boy, I can get any food delivered right away now, and I can order it on my phone and all that good stuff. So it becomes very popular. Mm-hmm. Sooner or later, for any paradigm, the solution kind of slows, because most of the problems are being solved, but not all of them. And that's where there's room for new paradigms. Now, what's interesting today is that the coronavirus, I won't call it a paradigm, because it's not solving problems, it's creating problems. And it basically busted the paradigm for many, many organizations in many different industries. Their very successful paradigm, fast food, retail stores, brick and mortar, mm-hmm. their basic, very successful paradigm, right in the center of that B point of that curve, tremendous problem solving for everything we wanted to do, just got broken. We've got that break in there because it's a time break, mm-hmm. but that's actually a good point to break, that says the coronavirus just broke that curve.
So on that point then, Jim, for those of people who've created plans under their old paradigm, right? Mm-hmm. Right now, that space, that break is pretty predominant for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And they're probably going right now, So where do I take my organization where we don't even know what the end of this looks like? I mean, I know that in the US, for example, the president said that we're probably going to be in a kind of a lockdown mode until the end of April. So that's another 4 weeks where
Yep.
people are trying to figure out this known and a lot of unknowns that are going to kind of continue to emerge. So what do we do with that kind of space?
Well, here's the key, and we're going to get to that because that's what the implications wheel has the power to help people with. But here's the key, and it goes back to your point, Scott, about linear thinking.
Yep.
Because one of the things that I'm hearing in several things that I've seen and a couple of people I've talked to is, okay, as soon as this ends, we just go back to where we were. The paradigm's broken for now, but it's simply broken until the end of April. And the minute we go back and the quarantines are lifted, everything will simply go back to normal.
It's so funny. I was talking to a client today, and they've been really fighting telework, or they've had telework for a number of years in their organization. But some employees were told, no, you cannot telework. Like you can't telework. But now everyone's teleworking, and so they're not going to be able to say to an employee, you can't telework, because they're going to say, for the last 8 weeks, I've been teleworking. So they're not going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle on this one, because they're going to have to figure out how they manage that pretty much a mobile workforce, and one that wasn't very traditional in that space. It's going to be really interesting how they do it, because they're in a unionized environment, where it's been always kind of a rub between a manager who likes to have control and the employee wants to have their autonomy. So that's part of the thing. But
and I'll give you a very specific example of this, and it's also a good message that you've got to watch. You got to watch the big things. You got to watch the big trends that are happening fast, and you got to watch little things. My children's mother is in the nursing profession, and obviously going crazy working in a hospital. She was told that she could work from home 4 days a week because she's a supervisor, so she's got a lot of paperwork and stuff to do. She worked at home for 1 day, and she got an email saying, you can't work at home, you've got to work in the hospital, because the director of the hospital found out that we told a bunch of people they could work from home, and he is not happy with that.
Wow. Hey, so we have a question here. It says, in terms of going back to normal, can't we say that because of this virus, we have to create a new normal?
Yeah, it's another way of saying it, but it's a different future. So it's not going to be the same. It's not going to go back to being the same I believe for most organizations. We don't know what the changes are going to be. But if we simply come back and say, well, we're just going to have a new normal, and we're still going to have X number of people working for us in our factory, or we're going to have X number of people dining in our restaurants, that new normal is going to be very different. So I'm a little uncomfortable with the term, because I think it's going to be a different normal.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. So the big thing that I've seen the importance of understanding this is that the coronavirus has busted the very successful problem-solving paradigms for many organizations and many industries. And when it returns, it is not going to just jump on that curve and go back to the way it was. There's going to be some very new paradigms that are going to become implemented by organizations. They're going to discover by necessity, or they're going to be proactive and look for them. They're going to be looking for new solutions to problems. And that's where understanding paradigms come in. Because one of the interesting things, and I'll just make one quick point about this, is that very often new paradigms come from outside the industry, what we call paradigm pioneers. They don't come from within the industry. I'll give you the example that most people are familiar with. I referenced it earlier. The iPod didn't come from Sony. Sony was the dominant player in music players. They dominated cassette players and CD players. They didn't develop the digital music player. Came from outside. Most new paradigms that really bust the curve and come up with a whole new way of solving problems come from outsiders. So one of the things that organizations need to watch now, this relates back to my comment earlier about watching outside your own industry, is solutions for some of these things we're facing and some of the things we don't know about yet in the future are going to come from outsiders. So we need to watch for that.
Which goes back to that monitoring question then,
Yes.
within the context of what do we want? So a couple other questions just came up. So in this new future normal, more will be working remotely or teleworking. However, thoughts on the inability of cable companies' inabilities to scale up and pivot to meet the bandwidth demand, which one of the implications of the whole entire system crashes because we just don't have the bandwidth as a possibility.
Right.
And then go ahead.
You can speak to that, Scott. I'm just, the one I'm watching is the one we're using. Apparently Zoom is just exploded over the last 2 weeks.
Yep. And
apparently they're still handling the bandwidth. So,
Yeah, tap wood. I know I'm getting extended where I live. I'm getting a bigger bandwidth put in tomorrow because my daughter's coming back from college to study. So she'll be on the internet. I'll be on the internet. So we just needed more bandwidth. But anyway, another comment here. With these insights in mind, I would love to hear Jim's take on that age-old belief in organizations that past performance is the best predictor of future performance. What are your thoughts on that one?
That's a very interesting comment, because one of the things that I do in addition to being a futurist is help people hire more effectively. And in that world, one of the things I say is past performance is the best predictor of future performance for measuring, for making decisions about hiring people. I think from an organizational standpoint that is up for challenges, because we've seen too many examples in organizations where extremely successful organizations lock themselves into a paradigm and therefore ignore the new paradigm that's out there. So organizations, and unfortunately for the most part, I'll have to use some US examples here, but Sears got put out of business by online shopping like Amazon, and they missed a paradigm shift, and their tremendous success didn't last.
Well, Macy's just furloughed 125,000 of their employees. You think they're going to be opening it back to normal when the things happen? Maybe during Christmas I think honestly what's going to happen, you're going to see more of shops like Macy's be opening up for it'd be like a carnival, like it's going to be an experiential holiday rather than 365 days a year, because I'm thinking of like the Macy's shop in Union Square in San Francisco or in New York. It's going to be more of an experience rather than an ongoing brick and mortar model. So I could see that unfolding, where it's going to be more entertainment shopping is going to be kind of the future thing. So
or another good example, and this is looking at what's the impact going to be on malls. Bath and Body Works was one of the first businesses to shut down all of their retail stores. They shut them down very quick, and they basically sent out an email saying we're shutting down all our stores so that we can shift all of our inventory to online orders. Well, who's gonna need to ever go back to Bath and Body store anymore if I now find out that I can easily order everything online from them? So it's going to be a dramatic change. And then, of course, we've got other classic examples of Kodak being put out of business basically because they missed digital photography, which, by the way, for those who don't know, they invented it. And we've got, of course, the classic Swiss watch story that's on the Paradigm video. So the past performance of organizations in a lot of industries has not been predictive of future performance. And that ought to be a scary message for organizations that are looking at some of this massive disruption that's occurring right now.
Sure. Another question just came up here, Jim. How does one deal with organization leaders that are stuck in the same old way of doing things? How does one raise the organization above that? So how do you get the organization to move past the leader's paradigm?
Great question. And I'll give you the simple answer is, first of all, make sure they watch the Paradigm video because they need to do that. And I made reference to this when I started this little segment. I said, this has kind of got an interesting coincidental thing for me, because it started a little bit before the coronavirus certainly started hitting the United States. But I did a presentation on paradigms to a group of high school and college kids that were being assembled for a youth advisory board for an organization in the healthcare industry out in Vancouver, Washington in the beginning of January. At the end of the presentation, the CEO of the company came up to me and said, "How fast can you come back here?"
Mm.
And I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "I need you back here to spend at least a day with my senior leadership team to teach everybody on my senior leadership team about paradigms."
Yeah.
And I just did that. I just did that session 10 days ago.
So yeah, well, you went into the hot zone to teach this thing, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So the question that I have, or at least the comments, is where can people go to see that video? Because I know I have my copy. I ordered it many years ago. I probably need to re-up it because it's just it's been worn out. But is there a place that people can go online to see the video?
They can watch a preview online at Star Thrower, and we can make that connection available.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll send it to everyone. I'll get it from you, Jim, and I'll just send it to everybody.
The other thing is we can talk about what else we can do. I can talk to Todd at Star Thrower and see what else we can do. Because what I'm doing right now, following the fact that I got to do it in the hot zone and then I came home, is now I'm having some people ask me, can I do that workshop online?
Yeah, I think that would be great. Okay.
So the answer is yes, I can do a paradigm workshop online,
Great.
And they watch the video as part of that. So yeah, definitely.
Great. All right, let's move on because I don't want to be pushing too much, but there's so much here. So
any other, okay. That takes us to the implications wheel. Mm. The implications wheel, and I'm going to show it to you in a couple of minutes in a couple of different ways. The implications wheel falls into that category of being a strategic exploration tool that is a divergent thinking tool. It is designed to facilitate the exploration of really the short and long-term implications, both positive and negative, that cascade out from a specific change. It is a true scouting tool. This is a tool for scouting the future. What we always talk about with introducing the scouting tool, and we have found that this way of looking at it works anywhere in the world. Joel has used this way of talking about the implications wheel everywhere in the world, even though we talk about something that's very American in the Old West. When the wagon trains went out in the 1800s to move west, they always sent out scouts ahead of the wagon train. Well, what were the scouts looking for? Well, they were looking for a safe passageway. They were looking for water. They were looking for food for the animals. They were looking for easy pathways. They were looking for all kinds of ways to safely move forward. But what did those scouts have to do? Well, number one, they had to work very fast. If the scout left and said, "I'll be back in 2 weeks," they didn't have much value. So the scouts had to work very quickly to identify information. And boy, that's a good message for today, because our scouts need to be able to work fast because of how fast everything's changing. Mm-hmm. Secondly, our scouts need to scatter. This ties right back to the comment we've referred to about 3 times about we can't send all of the scouts out in the same linear direction. We've got to send our scouts out in different directions to look at different things, to cover a lot of territory, to find out what's going on. Third, our scouts are sampling. They are getting qualitative, good information, but it is not quantitative. They are not telling us that the river ahead is 50 meters deep and we can't cross it. They're coming back and saying the river is too deep to cross, or the river looks good, it looks shallow enough that we can make it. The surveyors actually came back later, years later, and measured the depth of things. Right. But we're sampling, we're getting qualitative, not quantitative information. And if the scouts couldn't come back and draw a map for the wagon master, the information had very little use. The scout would have been just talking about, well, there's a bunch of stuff out there. So the scouts had to be able to come back and sit around the campfire and draw a map of where the pathway looked best. And then most important, and this is one of the things that we literally drill into the minds of our facilitators, is the implications wheel provides decision enhancing information for leaders. It is not a decision tree. It does not make decisions for an organization. It provides information for leaders to make decisions.
I mean, I think that's a good distinction, because a lot of times, because when you get done with the tool, I think what's happening is you have to be able to see the landscape, and then in a way it's making decisions based upon the data that's out there, and it doesn't necessarily give you a particular direction to go. It gives you multiple directions that you can choose from. So
Yep. Yep, and it's very interesting, and I'll share a quick specific example of this, because most of the facilitators, and because I'm the master trainer for this, and Joel's director of training, I work with all of our facilitators. Most of our facilitators work in the area of strategic planning.
right.
I do strategic planning for organizations, as well as this strategic exploration work, and most of our facilitators are in that space. Joel never went to that space.
Mm-hmm.
Joel works with an organization. He does an implications wheel with them, produces all this information, and very often they'll say, well, now tell us what to do. And Joel goes, no, here's the information. This is your decision.
Right. Well, he's
you
also
decide
created
what to do.
Yeah, but he's created the strategic matrix and some
The
other
strategy
things
matrix.
Yeah, that help them, make the decision that's best for them. Because I think he's really smart in saying, well, I don't, because this is your baby. You guys know this stuff.
This is
I
your call,
totally
folks.
Yeah, exactly.
This is your call, folks. It's really interesting. I've done several sessions with major organizations with Joel, and it's like, okay, here's this information, will help you interpret it, but you're the ones that have to make the decisions.
But and I think that's where the leadership has really sometimes failed, because people are. I was doing a work with a city last year, and we were talking about what are the blocks that might get in the way, and the mayor said fear. Like the paralyzing impact of fear, especially when we have so many unknowns. To me, I think this helps shore up like some of the best directions to go to. I mean, the data, when you look at after you score the wheel, it gives people a sense of directional places. And again, it's not just one direction. It's multiple directions that you want to be going through as an organization. At least continue to explore or drill down or kind of decide where you're going to invest your time and energy to kind of go down based upon the best possible. Because I've seen an implication wheel where we ask the question, implications of buying a certain hospital versus not buying a certain hospital, and they said, well, if we buy it, it didn't really pencil, but someone then said, what if we don't? And then it penciled. So the way you ask the question is also really critical in going through this process.
Absolutely, and you've referred to one of our greatest examples of the importance of defining the question that you want to answer. That's one of the things that I'm working on right now with a couple of situations. I've got a session scheduled first thing tomorrow morning with an organization, and I just work with them over the weekend saying, we got to get the right question here, because you're talking about your future. It's critical. And what's the question you really want to ask? And that's one of the things that our facilitators learn how to do, is to phrase those questions correctly. So the key point that we drill into our facilitators, as I mentioned before, is that this is not people look at this and say, well, that's a decision tree, and it's like, no, it's not. This is decision enhancing information for leaders. So it's a structured process for scouting the future. It's got the same attributes as scouting, as I just mentioned. It works with small groups who work. Normally, we like to see people work in teams of 5 to explore a particular direction that they go out and look at. As I mentioned before, with all of the strategic exploration tools, we want them to be very inclusive. We want to focus on diversity. We talk about, one of the things that I didn't put in this set of slides as I put them together today, was we always talk about the implications wheel as a process in which every voice is heard. When we do a strategic exploration session, for example, Scott, you just mentioned working with a city. There's an example on our website of a part of a strategic exploration we did with a city in Minnesota a few years ago. We got 85 people together for a Saturday, all day. not for a town hall meeting, because everybody listening on this webinar can imagine what a town hall meeting on all day Saturday would be like in terms of the number of people that we get to talk, etc. We did an implications wheel for 8 hours and 85 people talked for the entire day.
Yeah, yeah.
In groups of 5.
Yeah.
They were all involved in it throughout the day.
And what's really cool about this, Jim, I know I was working with a city, and it was really a countywide, and they were looking at whether to build a new sewage plant or tap into the one across the county lines. And it really divided the community up. And so there was a number of people that showed up to the meeting. And what was interesting is that you had someone who was pro and someone who was con at the same table. And if you really want to see people really come together because their thinking becomes more and more refined as they go through the process, someone who is adamantly opposed to something because the exercise forces you to think both positively and negatively about the future, it's amazing how people's minds begin to shift when they see the implications because of that trap we get into when we think too linearly and just go, if we do this, that'll be great. And that's why we get into trouble, because we're going, gosh, we made the wrong decision because we didn't kind of do the landscape. We didn't do the scouting. But I've seen a lot of really high intense topics get kind of really mitigated just because the process itself allows for people to be heard and to have a say, which is going back to the psychological safety work that I do a lot of. That's the key, feeling heard and having a say builds community. So
absolutely.
This process,
and that's one of the things that comes out of every session that we did.
Yep.
I did a demo when I was out in Washington State 2 or 3 weeks ago. I did an implications wheel with that group, and after it was over, I said, what was different about this than other discussions? This was the strategic leadership team. This was the top 12 people of the company and some other guests. I said, how is this different from other conversations that you have in this organization? And the first comment was, well, everybody was heard. I said, yeah, that's the difference. We create a dynamic where that's possible. And the only difference is, people look at our scouting example and say, well, I'm not riding out ahead of a wagon. I said, no, you're not. We're scouting over the horizon of time. We're saying, let's look ahead in time and let's see what happens in the future. And that's a very important point for what's happening right now, because we've had a couple of people call and say, can you do an implications wheel on the coronavirus? And my first answer is no, it already happened.
Yeah.
It already happened. It's already second, third, and fourth order stuff.
Right.
You've got to identify something that's in the future, and talk about something. So the biggest thing we're talking about with a couple of people is, how is our business going to change when it ends? The one that I'm doing tomorrow morning is with a relatively small college, and their question is, what is our college going to look like in September?
As a result of the coronavirus infection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
what assumptions are you building behind that question? Because you must.
Well, what they're building is pretty simple, and part of it's because it's a small college. Right now, they have a residential campus, and they have an online component, but none of their residential students have done anything online. So the question they're looking at is, what happens in September? Do we merge and introduce, because all of their residential students are now online.
Right.
So they're looking at, how do we mix that? What are the implications of mixing that in September, where we want our students to be residential because we've got athletics, we've got performing arts, but they've all now been introduced to online learning. So what happens if we mix with our residential students, we mix in online learning? What are the implications of that?
Right.
So it's a very good question that they're facing, but they're asking a question about September,
right,
with the assumption that the virus will be over by then, and that's a valid assumption to make.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
What can you put into the center of an implications wheel? The topic of significant events is normally at the bottom of this list, and I changed it and put it at the top because obviously that's going to be the focus of a lot of people. But what you can explore with the implications wheel is a significant event. You can explore an innovation, yours or your competitors. You could explore the implications of a trend. I referenced cyberbullying as an unintended consequence as it's being mentioned related to everything happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other examples is on the website. People can look at a sample of it from is what are the implications of the continuing trend of cyberbullying continuing to happen. The implications wheel has been used very successfully in mergers and acquisitions from a standpoint of what's going to happen if we acquire this firm or if we merge, and was used very extensively in the banking industry decades ago now to evaluate mergers and acquisitions when they were in their heyday of merging and acquiring.
I remember I was doing something around a merger and acquisition several years ago with a client, and it was in the healthcare space. And one of the things that the board said that if we were able to get bought out, it would allow us to make decisions more quickly. And it just pissed the CEO off. He goes, "What do you mean? It's just like, why aren't we just making decisions?" But what's interesting is what surfaces in a lot of this stuff is some of the human dynamics that are holding organizations back, because they're now going back to that safety zone when they're having these conversations. Stuff that they haven't been able to talk about, they were able to talk about. And what ended up happening is they just changed their process a little bit, and they got back on track, and they ended up buying other companies. So instead of being acquired, they actually started acquiring others because they made decisions more quickly. It was a fascinating conversation, but the CEO is livid. It's like, what do you mean? It was like,
well, what happened years ago, with a different variation on the example you just gave, is that one of the major banks that was out acquiring a lot of banks in that era of bank mergers and acquisitions. Yep. What they did is they did an implications wheel on what are the implications of acquiring Bank A. They then went to Bank A, and Bank A did an implications wheel from their perspective on what are the implications of us being acquired by this large banking organizations. And after they each completed their implications wheel, they exchanged them. So they got to see what the other side did. And there were two interesting things that happened. First of all, and this is kind of the surprise, it slowed down the mergers. Didn't stop them, but it slowed them down.
Right. So they can get their ducks in order probably more.
Right. Yeah, because that's the second thing. Once the merger took place, they went much more smoothly.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet.
Because they had identified things.
So what does the wheel look like? Because I think people on there probably go, what are we talking about? So.
What are we talking about? Yep. New regulations, internal policies, new strategic objectives, all of those are potential subjects for the wheel, and I can talk more about almost any of those more later on. What does the wheel look like? It is non-linear in form. It is based on concentric circles and spokes, and it grows bigger and broader as you fill it out. And this is an absolute key point. It basically looks like this. Those are first order implications. You then have second order implications, and you then have third order implications. Yeah. So what you're looking at is a pretty accurate, yes it is, it's an extremely accurate graphic representation of an implications wheel that contains a center question in that big circle in the middle, contains what we would call 8 first order implications, those smaller but still bigger white circles coming out of the center. For each of those first order implications, there are 5 second order implications that have been identified. And then for each of those second order implications, we identify third order implications. So we go out normally to the third order. And the important thing to recognize about the value of the implications wheel is where are most of the surprises?
On
Scott,
the edge. Yeah, on the edge.
You know this.
Yep.
On the edge.
Yep.
We know what's around the corner. It's pretty easy. You know, I worked with 2 or 3 different groups just over the weekend coming up with first order implications. They're pretty easy. I mean, it's not, it takes a little bit of discussion and identification, but it's pretty easy to think about what might happen next.
Right.
But it's what happens after that that's important.
And I think it's important to highlight to the group is that when you look at those 8 kind of those eight, you're asking for people to come up with both positive and negative implications of that center question. So what might occur if blank were to happen? And you have to think of both positive and negative first level implications.
I was just going to mention that, Scott, because that's critical. It's like, well, because I've had a couple people ask me that. Well, this coronavirus, everything that's happening to us is negative. And I'm going, no.
Yeah.
You got to think about this. You got to have at least one positive and one negative off of every one of these splits.
Yep.
And every one I've done over 20 years has been something that surprised, because that's another thing that we ask people after we've done one of these. We say, what did you see that surprised you?
Right.
And it's like, wow, were we surprised? We hadn't thought of any of this stuff.
And I think that's the part, is that, as a discipline in thinking for those who are listening, one of the things I find, and this is where we get into trouble, we get into that linear thinking, especially when we're stressed out, our prefrontal cortex shuts down and we go to automatic mode. We go into kind of just a very rational versus let's pull back and really take a look at what might occur with all of these things. And yeah, that one bad thing can happen, but so could this good thing. You got to pull people back. And I've seen this a lot around policymakers where, we're dealing with a local policy around, legalizing or like bringing in, giving out needles, for example. And it's like, it's just tearing up the community rather than just saying, what are all of the implications? Let's do this from a policy perspective. But I want to forewarn people. What I found doing this in the federal sector, I've shared this workshop in a couple different agencies that I work with. And I remember doing a kind of an overview of bringing this in as a possibility. And one of the guys said, hey, I don't know if I want to do this because now we no longer have plausible deniability, because all of a sudden you got to ask yourself, what are you going to do if you see something negative happen in that second level? If you decide to go down that path. People love the tool, but they don't know what to do with it because they no longer can say, we didn't know. It's like, it just blows my mind when I'm working with, organizations that actually have influence. So
I did a presentation to a group in the employee benefits field a few years ago and did a little demo. They all did a little quick exercise, and I had that exact same question asked of me. Young man, he raised his hand and said, why would I ever want to know all of this?
Yeah.
And I said, I'm not sure I understand your question. And he said, why would I want to know all this stuff that could happen? Then I can't push for what I want. Like, what? And then Joel actually worked with a group of Senate aides, and they gave him the plausible deniability. They said, this is great. We want to use this tool all the time. And Joel asked, are you going to share that with your bosses? And they said, never.
Yeah. Which I think
plausible deniability.
Well, in a span where we have to be transparent, I think this is where you're starting to see the importance. If I'm leading my organization and I'm doing this with my executive team, we better be really forthright. Not only that, but if you have a team, get their perspectives, going back to what you were saying earlier about that diversity and inclusion. Sometimes the innovation, going back to the edges, comes from the bubble. We have another question coming in here. How do you push the consequences of not taking action, i.e. liability risk management?
I'll answer. It's a little bit ahead of the discussion, but I'll answer it quickly. When you have the results of an implications will exploration, when you have the kind of data, which is usually more than what you see here with this representation of 8, and I'm going to show you a real example that's really fascinating in a minute here or so. You go through a process, and again, this is the leaders, but we do provide some guidance on this. You go through the process of saying, okay, what can we do about these things? Because first of all, these implications get scored. We haven't talked about that yet.
Right. I think that would be helpful.
These implications get scored for, I think we've talked about that. Here's what an actual implications wheel looks like. And I'm going to go to this actual wheel, which was on a flu pandemic that was done in 2007. Actually did one on a flu pandemic occurring in February and early March. How's that for accuracy? Those implications are scored on 2 elements. They're scored for desirability and likelihood. So you see in this example that you see a lot of things that are blue. Those have some kind of a likelihood, desirability, a positive desirability score associated with them. If there's a circle around the blue one, it also means it's more likely, it's been assessed as more likely to occur. And obviously the flip side is if it's red, it's undesirable from the point of view that's been chosen. And if there's a circle, it's likely. And if there's a star, it's been scored as a -50, which means it's been scored as potential catastrophic. And you can actually see that our implications wheel on a flu pandemic done in 2007 has a lot of very scary things on it. And it's very interesting because a lot of these things are happening right now.
And I want to pull back on this one, Jim, because I think this is where, even if you're not doing an implications wheel, what I found when I'm working with groups, when someone says that can't happen, I will say is that can't happen because you don't want to do it, or right, it's not desirable for you, or you don't see it as being likely. And sometimes pulling those two apart is really helpful, because the way I kind of look at this when I'm facilitating groups, if something is highly desirable and not very likely, it's a question of investment, right? If something's highly undesirable but highly likely to occur, it's a question of mitigation. If something's high likelihood, high desirability, then that's some of your low-hanging fruit, but you have to consider all the other things. And then if it's low, you probably don't need to put too much energy into it. But some of the things, to Jim's point earlier, where you see a red with a ring around it, for example, on the very top there, you see the question, what are the possible implications, right? You go up, you see that second level implication there. It's probably a third level, or I guess a second level, with the stars around it. But then you see small little blue signs off that. So one of the questions we'll sometimes say is, how do we skip that and go right to that blue? You start thinking about bridging and so there's all kinds of ways in facilitating this that you start to help people's thinking along to say, well, how do we mitigate that? And that's where when I'm working with federal agencies, where that whole plausible deniability is, that we don't have the resources to mitigate right now. And it's like, no, you just don't have the willingness to do it, because there's other things you have to do to make that happen. So, because I don't know, this is where I think we have to be really disciplined in getting out of a linear way of thinking, especially with this pandemic, because it is having system-wide implications all over the world.
Absolutely. And another thing that shows up here that I think is very important is, and you kind of alluded to a little bit there, but what happens some ways, and the advantage of having a map, is that you have what the map reveals sometimes is a pathway. And in a lot of organizations, and I remember this being a critical point with the one of the cities that I worked with a few years ago, the mayor called me over towards the end and said, Jim, I got to ask you about this, because this is one of our biggest problems. We have something that looks like it's a good initiative. So the first order is blue. The second order is red. So we stop the initiative and we don't go any further. Failing to realize, as this just shows us, that after that, everything's blue.
Right.
And I'm going, okay. And I said, okay, now what's the flip side of that? And he said, well, the flip side is we've got this initiative that initially is red. So we stop that one.
Yeah.
Or initially is blue, and we jump right into it.
Right.
Okay, this looks good. Let's do it. Let's
Right.
jump on this bandwagon. And then we run into, and he used the term, he said, then we get down the pathway and we run into all these unintended consequences. And I said, yep. And you just identified them.
Yeah, in the description of this session, I talked about, let's not find ourselves getting to the point like we say to ourselves, if we only would have known then what we know now, we wouldn't have gone down this path. And I think that's the whole point of this exercise. And in working with your organizations that are dealing with having to make some adjustments right now, just making the time to just think through this a little bit more deeply, you'll start to find that maybe, because we talk about the black swan or those innovations, again, they might surface at the very edge, and it might even completely repurpose a lot of the work that people are doing out there. So it's a worthwhile exercise. I want to kind of see if there are any verbal questions. I can open up. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and I will allow you to talk if you wish to talk. But I'm just curious to know if anyone has some questions that maybe you would like to ask Jim directly around this particular tool.
And while you're collecting those, Scott, I'm gonna kill this, and I'm gonna go and find the wheel.
Okay, great. I don't know if kill was a good metaphor, by the way, but Any questions specifically? Because I want you to be thinking about this. If you're sitting and you're watching this and you're thinking about your own organization, it can feel really overwhelming. But what I found is it's a discipline in how we think. So I see a question
Scott, have
here.
you got the wheel? Is the wheel showing on your end?
I see that. I just see your website on the pandemic, just the regular page. I don't see the wheel yet.
Okay, but you've got the opening of the software.
Yeah, and we have someone here. Mark Jones has a question.
Okay,
for you.
good.
Okay, Mark. Okay, Mark. You're gonna need to unmute yourself. You're allowed to talk, Mark. You need to unmute yourself.
How's that?
Okay, we can hear you, buddy.
Okay. And Scotty, look, I guess from a facilitator's perspective, one of the challenges would be we're going to get to some point through this discussion where you're bringing up cultural sensitivity, so to speak, like the undiscussables. How do you navigate your way through those difficult and robust conversations?
What we've discovered is, in most cases, and there are some exceptions, what we've discovered is the process of having a number of people get together. So for example, I gave the example of 85 people from the community. You create these diverse teams, and you create diverse teams within the five. That 5-person team is as diverse as possible. But you also very carefully put together the teams in terms of who those people are. And what we've discovered in most cases, and there are exceptions, and I've got some stories of some exceptions that are negative, exactly what you're talking about. But what we find out in most cases, that diversity of the team allows those issues to come up because of how you assign which first order for those different teams to discuss. So you assign, you send the scouts out where you want the scouts to look at, and you send the scouts out to go that direction. So raise those issues.
Right. And I think, again, one of the other things that I've seen on this one, Mark, specifically, is because they have to come up with positive and negatives. No matter what, they're bubbling their pain points, or they're bubbling their positions. What this starts to do, it starts to flesh out those positions in a way that I can start to see it from that perspective. Because again, when you're forced to think positively and negatively around an implication, it does something to the brain that I don't think is typical, and that is it's forcing you to think opposite of what you typically would, and that sometimes mitigates a lot of that stress.
The other thing I want to stress, Mark, is because, as I said, it's not perfect. There are cases where what you raise is a serious issue, but in most cases we've been able to deal with it. But I'll give you a couple of examples. In many cases, one of the things that I've done frequently is I'll discover that there's a person on a particular team who's dominating that team, and I'll pull that person out of that team and put them somewhere else. I've never done this, but I know Joel has. Joel has kicked the CEO of a company out of a session.
Okay.
He tells
generally
that story.
That could be where the roadblock is.
Yeah, he tells that story very proudly. He was doing a session, and the CEO was dominating, and people weren't talking, and he went up to the CEO and said, "Go back to your office. You're done." Now, he can do that. I've never had the guts to do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many other dynamics that can occur, especially when people are stressed out. But so this is kind of the software, and I think that one thing that I want to highlight, I think we have another question here.
Yeah, because I want to show this.
Okay, so Catherine, go ahead. What's your question? Go ahead. You have to unmute yourself, Kate.
There we go.
Yep.
So quick question. As much as I also work with organizations, most of my work is with leaders and individuals in those organizations. And we are clearly seeing now that a number of people who have lost jobs are not going to be going back to the jobs they had. There's going to be, has already been, huge job loss, and we're about to see a whole lot more. How do you apply this methodology or this practice to individuals who are really going to need to get very creative, think in terms of future implications? How do you do this with individuals?
It's certainly possible to do it. And the question would be, how to get the right group to get behind it. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the other things that I work heavily in is the whole area of career counseling and coaching. And I work and have done a lot of writing for a couple of organizations, and this is something where, an HR organization or one of the organizations out there, one of the ones where I'm formally a coach is with a vet organization, is to say, to get some of the people that are involved with those organizations to take a look at the implications of that exact question that you just raised.
Mm.
So from an individual standpoint, what are the implications for an individual, and to see where that's going, because that's going to be a critical issue, because as I mentioned earlier, exactly the thing that you mentioned. I've talked to a number of people who have said, I've laid off. I talked to one of our facilitators last week who said she just talked to one of her friends and they laid off 85 people, their entire staff of a restaurant. And it's like, and I said, well, do they understand the implications of how many of those people aren't going to come back?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a question that some of our very good human resource organizations, some of our very good organizations that work in career counseling, as I mentioned, helping vets and et cetera, they ought to be jumping on that question. And I would love to jump on that question with them to do an implication, because people are going to make, the problem is, and I think I can hear it in your question, the problem is the people that are affected by that are equally likely to make some bad short-term decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're not going to look at the implications. So they're going to, maybe they're going to be okay for a while because they may get a job and make some money, but they're going to make some long-term career decisions that aren't best for them. And it would be better if they had more information up front onto what they should do. Simple things like, one possibility is they should be seriously looking at making sure their resume looks good, not just how quick they can prepare it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of good things that excellent question. I'm writing it down because it's prompting me to think about some other people I should contact about it with that question.
Yeah, and just so you know, what Jim's showing on the screen now is the online version. So what's nice about this tool is you can ask a question and you can send it out across the entire globe and have people actually respond to the question. So to your point, Kate, it's something that if Jim decides to ask that question and I get a link, we can potentially send, so you can add your thinking to it, right? So
Great.
Yeah, we've talked about this right now as groups of people coming together in teams of 5 live together. We can also do that online with a team, but there's also a 24/7 remote feature that we use, and obviously that's what we're being asked to do more of right now. But here's what it actually looks like. So here's that wheel, and I'm not going to show you the whole thing because the screen would have too many things on it. So you can see I've actually got a setting over here that says 8 arcs per page. So I'm actually going to show you what this particular wheel looks like, not just that picture. Here's what this whole wheel looks like. So there's the center. And as I described before, what we then do is we generate first order implications. So here's 8 of those first order implications. So hospitals focus almost all of their attention on dealing with the impending flu epidemic. This is from 2007, folks. What's going on right now? I mentioned my kid's mother, their hospital closed their ER to take over. It's like, okay, we're only going to deal with the flu stuff, Then, as I talked about in terms of how this is built, then you add second orders. And I want to repeat this. Scott's mentioned it a couple times, but it's actually critical. These things have to be both positive and negative. But then for each of those first orders that's developed, you come up with 5 second order implications off of each one of those. And then you come up with third order implications for all of those, so that you have a first order and you have 5 second orders. And this is obviously one, this was a real one. So there's some of this that didn't get completed. So there's some second orders that didn't get completed. But then for each of those second orders, you come up with third orders. And there's actually one that looks like it's got 6.
Staff with children do not report to work, which is actually happening because the employees are saying it's not worth the risk. And I just read an article where a woman just quit because she just couldn't be away from her kids because she's a single mom and was being asked to do something that she wasn't in a position to want to do. And the moral and ethical dilemma that we're putting a lot of these healthcare workers in. I mean, that's a really real implication.
Very real, again, 2007. And this was done by VHA Foundation, so it's obviously a very knowledgeable expert group of people looking at it from a hospital standpoint. So it's very real. And then, as we've shown you before, we then score it. So all of a sudden we get all that color that pops up. And as to show you the whole thing, which I really shouldn't do this, but I'm going to have some fun doing it. Put them all on the same page. It's rather massive.
Wow. Well, and I think the thing that I want to highlight to folks is again, the reason why I wanted to bring Jim into this conversation for any of us in a position where we're having to be rethinking how we thought about our work 3 weeks ago, is recognizing that one possibility could be all of this stuff. And I think it's going to require a level of discipline. And what it does for me is I don't get worked up over that one bad thing happening. I want to continue to seek out and find, well, what else is possible? What else is possible? So you may not be well versed, or you may not have the resource at your your ability to use this right away, but you do have maybe a way of thinking now about what is going on in your organization, or what is going on in your organization, to kind of just keep asking the question of, so, well, what else could happen? What else could happen? Because when people get stuck in that first negative implication or positive implication, they can then get trapped on that logic line. And again, this is why when we do this wheel, we do it in concentric circles. So it's not just from the center circle up to the right where it's white, and then you build it out. You have to go it in concentric circles. Excuse me, you're not doing it linearly. Just the exercise alone is forcing the brain to think, more holistically, more integrative, broader. So is that relevant, Jim? I have another question coming up here.
Yeah, so I was going to say, do you have any more questions? Because we're going to be running out of time. So.
Yeah, how is the online version of the tool costed? So what are the costs associated to this particular framework?
There are a number of questions, and perhaps one thing we can do, because I want to see if there are any other questions, is follow up with some things with Scott.
Sure.
But this requires facilitators to be trained in how to use it. The training is actually a fairly intensive 3 to 5 day training to be a certified facilitator. We are developing, at the request of several people right now, developing the ability to provide that training online. But it's going to have to be for a group. It's not going to be for individual. We also, however, do have some step-by-step other options. Obviously, one of the things that we do is we do this for organizations from a consulting standpoint. We do what's referred to as a highly facilitated wheel. That's what this would have been. Joel did this wheel in 2007 with the VHA Foundation, and he went to them and put this whole thing together, and we did that. But we're also looking at a couple of new options because of the current conditions of, can we get somebody started in learning how to do the process with a quicker version of learning the process, but working with a certified facilitator. So kind of a partnership, because we're being asked to do it quickly. So there are a bunch of different options, and I'll work with Scott to follow up on that. And you can get a little bit of information for it on our websites, but again, I'll follow this up with Scott.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out to me specifically, because like I said, Jim has been always very gracious with his time with me, and I have to recert because it's I haven't done one actively in a while, so it's really an important tool. But again, my intent of wanting to share this with the Commons is, one of the things that I shared with a hospital a number of years ago was, and I think even Joel had shared this, like that the rate of change is happening so quickly that our ability to make decisions, we have to act quickly, but the implications of our decisions are becoming greater and greater. And so how do we, use a tool that enhances our ability to make decisions in a quick way? Because even a wheel like this, if you have enough people, you can build one out with the pre-work, because typically you come in and you just have small groups tackle those first arcs, if you will. From the middle question, you just divide them up into the teams, and you can build something like this in a very short amount of time. I don't want you to think that it's pretty overwhelming, and then it's just helping people make sense of it. But it's a discipline in thinking, because if we're playing if-then games all day long in the world that we're in with now, we're just either going to feel paralyzed or completely overwhelmed. and feel trapped because we maybe have chosen a path that there's no place to get back to. And I think a lot of organizations are really struggling with that right now because there are so many unknowns. But any other comments or questions, or Jim, anything you wanted to add?
I just want to show one thing real quick,
Sure,
because it refers back to that question about what do you do with the results of this, and we talked a little bit about bridges and barriers and information needs. One of the things that is an advantage of the software, and I just did it, I just said, show me the likely strong negatives. So only show me the stuff that's got scored pretty bad. And you can see the fact that I just came up with one that's red. But what's important about this is that it always shows the pathway. So here's a bunch of some red things, but it got started with a blue one. Mm-hmm. So it gets into that, okay, have we provided decision enhancing information for leaders to help them make decisions? And one of the things that can be done, because all of this can also be, I can print this very quickly right now. I can produce all kinds of different reports for a client to help them make decisions. And it turns out they're extremely easy to read. I've worked with several CEOs where I sat down to explain reports to them, and in minutes they're looking at it going, oh, this is clear. Look, what's this? What's this? And they can find the important things because of how the information is presented. And because it's a map, they see the pathways.
I've also seen it done when I've done similar work like this, Jim, and the committees, they break up into ad hoc committees where they work on their specialty areas, and it kind of really does promote this incredible collaboration, because they come back and report back on how they're either mitigating or they're promoting a particular, either a blue or they're mitigating a red. And then they start to leverage their resources more effectively. So it's a really good communication frame for people to use. But are there any other comments or questions? Hopefully there are some useful insights here to just be thinking about where you guys are in your current space, but also the importance of asking really good questions and seeking as much input as you possibly can from many different points of view. Because that's only going to help in letting this out. It can feel overwhelming if you allow it to feel overwhelming. But what it is information that's helping enhance your decision-making abilities within an organization or community. Or, I mean, I sometimes use this with kids around alcohol and drug use. I did one with an alcohol and drug prevention group many years ago when I first went through the training, where it's like, what are the implications of making poor lifestyle choices? That wasn't the next question, but it was really letting kids to see the implications of their choices. And amazing how, as a preventative measure, they got to talk themselves out of getting wasted every single day. So it works.
It's not Scott's wheel on that, but there is a wheel on youth alcohol and drug use. There's a sample of that one on our website. Yeah, that was done by my son, who's in that field.
Yeah. So any other comments or questions? Jim, where can people go to find out more information about the website and the work?
The implicationswheel.com is our main website that will show you a couple of other videos on the process, show you lots of examples. There's probably about 20 different examples that are on there, so you can see the range of different topics. There's also some basic information there about what the different options are in terms of how to work with it. But I'll also refer you to Joel's site, joelbarker.com. because that will not only give you a lead to the implications wheel site if you need it, but will also lead you to the things we're doing on paradigms right now, and it will also lead you to information on the other tools. There's a couple of other tools we didn't mention. We didn't mention tips. We didn't mention specifically tips tracking, although we talked about monitoring, which is we have a tool that plays into doing that process. And Scott referenced our strategy matrix tool, which is another one. And I talked a little bit about the vision part of it. So there's references on Joel's site to all these other things, because we have dedicated sites to all the tools, but you'll find the base of all of them at joelbarker.com.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I want to this has definitely been a long one, but I hope there is some value for you guys, and looking forward to, if you guys do have any questions, feel free to reach out, because again, I think many of us are going to be tackling some pretty big questions in our own organizations and in our communities. So really appreciate your time. Jim, always appreciate these conversations because you get my head thinking. I think there's one more question here. Just a comment says, thank you, Jim and Scott. So thank you, everybody. And
You're welcome.
I will be posting this recording and looking forward to hearing back from any feedback that you guys have, because again, this is a big pandemic we're under, and we got to do it together. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.